Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Sprint 64 review. Let's get started. Next slide. So today I'll be running the Sprint demo. I'll start with the Sprint statistics, then we'll move on to Carol with the community, back to me for architecture. And then we'll go through classic UI, service UI, providers, some stuff on the automate and the platform and the API, and we'll finish up with documentation. Next slide, please. So here you can see the top 10 repo stats. There were 525 closed PRs across 130 repos. We have 2 new repos this week, Ansible Tower Pods and Container Embedded Ansible. This is part of the work that Nick and Brandon are doing in containerizing all the things. So they've got Embedded Ansible in its own container, and that's actually built on top of Ansible Tower Pods, which is named such because it works and it's laid out in a similar fashion to our ManageIQ pods, where there's multiple images in a single Git repo. As far as the number of issues, pretty standard distribution, as you can see in the chart. Next slide, please. Across the ManageIQ repositories, as you can see, there's a healthy split between bug and enhancement. And smattering of all the rest. Next slide, please. This chart is the PRs merged per sprint across all of the repositories. As you can see, we jumped back up to 525 PRs closed from that little dip the previous week. I was looking at other statistics, and I believe because of the rearch effort, there was a lot of research that was going on in the previous, where the dip is. And those people that were doing the research weren't actively reviewing as many PRs or writing as many PRs. And this past week, once the research is kind of phasing out, they're starting getting into writing actual code. And then when they're in the code, they're actually reviewing more code. So it kind of came back up to normal. I don't know if that quite explains the amount of PRs, like that big difference, and we'll probably look into that a little further. Next slide, please. This is our repository health report. As you can see, things were relatively stable. Of note, there were 2 repos that had quite large drops in their GPA, Kubernetes and the overt provider. And in looking back, we've been doing a lot of work this past 2 weeks to try to split out some stuff from the gems pending repo and get rid of it. And one of the things that moved out was a Kubernetes module and an overt module that moved out of gems pending and back into the provider specific gem. So as it moved over, it had problems probably and needs to be cleaned up. But we'll circle around and see if we can get those numbers back up again. Another big drop you can see is the number of issues on the UI Classic side. I didn't really have a chance to dig into why it dropped, what dropped so much, but I do know that they've been doing a lot of work over there and cleaning up technical debt. So that's it. Next slide, please. And over to Carol.
Thank you, Jason. So on the community side, it's quite quiet recently because of the summer holidays. We had 2 last week in ManageIQ posts by Joe and Drew, respectively. And from this week on, you will be updated fortnightly, so once every 2 weeks in for the next 4 installments. So there will be no last week post this week. no post this week, but there will be next week and every 2 weeks until the end of August, and we will resume normal weekly schedule in September. For the website, there's a small update to the icons in the main page. So I don't know how many people have noticed, but you can take a look. It's quite nice, but subtle but nice change. And for the events, we are having a quiet couple of months, being the holidays and just a lower season for events. So But I'm also starting to look and prepare events for ManageIQ participation in the second half of this year. So if you have any suggestions, or if you are going to some events and you want some kind of support in terms of a swag or promotion or anything, you can contact me via Gitter. I didn't put my email there because they're easily parsed by web crawlers, but you can also email me at carol.chen@redhat.com. So if you have any comments or questions, just let me know. And I think that's it for this sprint. Thank you. Next slide, please.
Okay. For the architecture stuff, I have a lot less stuff this time. Like I said, last sprint was a lot of research, so I had a lot of different things to describe. This time it was a little bit more concrete, people making PRs and things like that. So on the Kubernetes front, as for the performance side of things, one PR that landed was the bundler groups that Joe Raffanello wrote. Basically took the gem file and broke up the gems into individual groups. And this allows him to then launch workers by eliminating entire gems, including provider plugin gems. So for example, when we spin up the VMware collector, we don't have to put the UI in it. And so that was merged. Mainly, it's not being leveraged at the moment, but it's mainly because there were so many changes to the gem file that it was getting very difficult to keep rebasing. And new gems that coming in moving forward should get placed in the proper bundler group. So if you're making changes there, please put them in the correct group. Another change that got in was Nick Lamuro worked on heartbeating of workers through a file. So he wrote a small script that can live on a container and will do the heartbeating and the heartbeat, we'll do the heartbeat validation so that Kubernetes can use that script as a heartbeat liveness check. So that's pretty cool. And he's ongoing doing more changes to that. On the MIQ replacement front, ActiveMQ Artemis is, as a replacement, seems very promising. Bill has been doing a lot of research on all different aspects of whether or not it can handle all the different ways we do things. And so far, it seems to cover just about everything. And Keenan and Madhu have been continuing to break down the existing callers, particularly of put unless exists and putter update, because those are the ones that are kind of complicated in the way that we use the queue. And although I think we can do them with ActiveMQ Artemis, if we can avoid them entirely, that would be better. So they're looking for alternatives for each of those individual callers and making sure we have a path forward for all those different places. On the metrics front, Elasticsearch, a lot of research was done on that in the past sprint, and it was determined that it may not be a fit for us because it seems to have poor long-term storage, doesn't have very good resiliency. It actually says that right on their website, which is interesting. They found that for our purposes, where we need to keep very long-term metrics on the order of 13 months to 2 years, that's really not what Elasticsearch is for. Most people use Elastic when they want to do long-term calculations. They take the data, they throw it in Elastic, they do some calculations, and then they just ignore it. And that's sort of the use case for it. And that's not our use case, and so it may not be a good fit for us. So because of that, they're continuing to investigate other time series databases. Marcel's looking into Hawkular metrics, and Chris Arcan is looking into sort of like our existing Postgres, but instead of individual columns, using JSONB instead, or perhaps just kind of rewriting in Postgres from scratch and seeing what happens. So they'll be looking at that. They started looking at that, and they'll be continuing to look at that. Next slide, please. And finally, on the inventory front, Adam did a spike where he changed the VMware inventory collection to go directly to wait for updates, which is the sort of the blocking call that you can make on the VMware side that gets you back direct changes. So the broker uses that under the covers to update its internal memory cache, and then the refresh worker queries from it. And we were trying to see if getting rid of that internal cache and sort of going directly from wait for updates directly into the database, see what that would look like. And it was extremely promising, as you can see from the numbers. Before with the broker, broker would take about 1.56 gigs on, I believe, a 10,000 VM. Oh no, sorry, this might have been smaller, but on a reasonably sized VMware system, a vSphere. 1.56 gigs for the broker, 778 meg for the refresh worker, for a total of 2.34 gigs, and it would take about 4.6 minutes to collect and parse all the data. This doesn't include persisting. This is just the front half of things. And he was able to get that down to 100 meg with a script that just pretty small. It just hits wait for updates, gets the data, and passes it through ActiveMQ Artemis. So we also got some cross-team integration going on here. And the demo was very, very cool. It was basically like live updating the screen. It was so fast. So I'm looking forward to see how much further he can take this and what kind of performance gains he'll get out of it. And that's it. Next slide, please.
Hello, everyone. So for the UI side, I have some stats of PRs that were merged in classic UI repo during the sprint. So total of 63 PRs were merged, and out of that, there were 5 enhancements, 37 bug fixes, 7 technical debt, and 7 refactoring PRs. I have some of the main ones highlighted here. So on the refactoring side, cloud subnets add and edit existing angularized forms were converted to consume REST API. And on the technical debt side, there was a lot of code cleanup that was done in the reports area, mainly in the code that renders reports. Some of the duplicated views and some of the duplicated code was removed. Some methods were refactored and renamed to make more sense. There was cleanup in various other areas such as pagination, CI processing module, and single delete handling. So when user is on the entity summary screen and they delete something, user is redirected to the show list screen. So that code was all cleaned up and extracted and unified into one place. On the enhancement side, we added a new type of catalog item. So in the catalog items editor, you will see in the type dropdown a new entry for container templates. And on the container template summary screen, we added a new button so the user can add a service dialog for a selected container template, very similar to a button that was already there on the orchestration template summary screen. And on the custom buttons side, in the custom buttons editor, it was changed to add a dropdown to support submitting all of the selected entities to run the custom buttons for the all selected entities at the same time. And on the physical infra topology screen, host and VM relationships were added. And finally, there was a CRUD support added for security group rules. And the new forms are angularized and support REST API. That is it from the UI side. Next slide, please.
Hi friends, Alan here for the Classic UI today. So what did we do this past sprint? About 16 stories were completed, and you can see from the list, we kind of broke them up by each of the functional areas where work was done. A lot of stuff was done in my services. 5 total stories were completed there. We did a little bit of work in the catalogs, custom dialogues, global authentication, and most of those stories related to some bugs that were undertaken. And then my services, the details page, snapshots page, and then a few global things, housekeeping things, and resource things. So if we go to the next slide, we can take a look at some of the highlights from these stories. Okay, so now for custom dialogues, we have drop-down lists, which in the drop-down list we have searching. So it's kind of like a type ahead. You have a really long custom dialogue. Now instead of scrolling, searching, and clicking, you can start typing out the word and it'll autocomplete. That's really cool. The other thing that we did is we now have custom buttons on the service details page of a VM. So when you click on from the services list, click on a service, you'll now see all the buttons that are associated, the custom buttons that are associated with that particular service. And then you can click on them and they'll do their thing. And that's super great. We also now can create snapshots from that service page. If you look down at the resources and you click on a particular VM, you can make a snapshot from that directly from the service details page. A bunch of bugs, more than are listed, fewer than I can remember. We did some focus on login bugs. We did some dialog bugs. There was some authentication bugs, some silly, styly things here and there. And then the big chore, as we do with every sprint, all of our dependencies are up to date. Latest and greatest of everything, with the exception of 4 dependencies that we can't update quite yet. And that's all I got from the service UI. I think we're up to next slide and Gregg next.
That's right. Thanks, Alan. So I'm back by popular demand, or actually Bruno's just on vacation, so you're stuck with me this week. I'm going to talk about some of the updates from several of the providers, including Hocular, Overt, Amazon, OpenStack, Azure, containers, and then some of the core ManageIQ stuff. So next slide. Oh yeah, some numbers. So you see Kubernetes and OpenShift are split in 2 different rows, but that's a lot of stuff coming out of containers this week or this sprint. Followed up by Rev and Amazon and some Azure stuff. And sneaking in there in the OpenStack and VMware side, you see some of the VMware updates that Jason was talking about with some of the work that Adam's been doing with awesome graph refresh in VMware. So next slide. All right, for Hocular, they added some targeted refresh, which was added to update the status and availability of deployments of EAP and deployments in EAP servers based on the collection of availability metrics. So this allows for more frequent updates of the availability data for the middleware objects and avoids having to do a full refresh when some of that data changes, which is really, really cool. Next slide. All right, for Overt, tons of graph refresh work from Piotr. Modi worked on some performance enhancements for the full refresh, and Boris added support for host maintenance modes. And next slide. All right, we got some EBS volume and snapshot events for Amazon added to the event switchboard. Includes things like create, attach, and delete volumes, and create, copy, and delete snapshots. And then for OpenStack, a secret fast refresh option was added, like the turbo button on those old 286s. It's actually it's tapping into if you happen to know that the user, the API user from OpenStack is an admin user, you can say that I am using an admin user, and it can use, I think it's deduplicating some of the API calls that would have to be done, and maybe using some of the admin APIs to make some faster calls. So it's a little bit of tuning we can do to make a faster refresh, but it does depend on having an admin user to do that. Next slide. All right, from Azure, a couple bug fixes around handling no or missing orchestration stacks and no private IP for a network. 2 cases that were bombing out the inventory collection that were fixed up by Dan. On the container side, still working on graph refresh. Benny's trying to knock that out, and also respecting the end time when collecting metrics. This is really important. I can't remember if the bug was on our side or on the Hocular side or some combination of the 2, but what ended up happening is I think we were sending a start date and an end date to say, here's the metrics that I want, and instead we were getting everything from the start date, which meant if we were asking for old metrics, we were asking for possibly tons and tons and tons of data, which would usually time out and sometimes even knock over Hocular. So that's been fixed up by the containers team. really important fix, and definitely appreciate it. All right, next slide. All right, on the core container side, also coming out of containers from Muli, he's been working on a monitoring manager, which kind of combines the idea of metrics and alerts. This is kind of in the infancy right now, so I'm still watching to see how the whole thing is unfolding. We're having discussions about it to see where this is all going to go. I think it's really interesting, and I know that they've been talking about metrics and alerts for a long time. So I'm kind of excited to see where this goes. From provider side, I think that's it. So over to Tina.
Okay, so for Automate, we had 26 PRs merged this sprint, 5 enhancements, 15 bugs, 3 technical debt, and 3 refactoring. I'd like to highlight a few of the changes that were made. We exposed AE state max retries to Automate. This gets us closer to the goal of enabling an Ansible service playbook designer to specify the playbook time to live, so that we can calculate the max retries enables us to calculate the AE state retry based on the time to live and the max retries. Container template provisioning. A change was made for container template provisioning dialogues not to consider fields that have auto-generated dialogue option as required. The ManageIQ Python API client that's used in Ansible Playbook Services can now authenticate requests using only an API token. Previously, credentials were required. A V2V automate method fix, which resolves a dialog issue with install driver's checkbox content display script error. The checkbox now properly displays that there's no ISO data store for the provider. A couple fixes for the VM migrate state machine. Previously, it didn't detect that there was any errors and the state machine would proceed. Now the state machine realizes it stops and catches and properly boards the state machine. So quota calculation for multiple VMs. We had an issue where the quota calculations were incorrect for cloud providers when multiple VMs were specified. And that's it for Automate. Next slide, please.
Okay, on the platform side, we had 43 PRs merged. As you can see there, most of them are bugs, 26 bugs, and then the rest spread out, 6 enhancements. So I'll just go through some of the highlights there. Enhancement-wise, we got a new report for Amazon Active VMs, and that was actually from someone outside the platforms team, so we appreciate that. And then Satowi added Samba common tools to the appliance. So that makes it easier for people setting up external auth to AD. They were having to actually add that package themselves every time, so this just makes it much easier. For bug fixes, so this one's an interesting one. With the forked workers, we realized that the workers were inheriting the signal processing from the server, so that when they got the sig term, they were actually executing the code that the server should have executed to delete the PID file. And what that led to is potentially having multiple server instances running at the same time on an appliance. You kind of have to go out of your way a little bit to do it, but anyway, LJ put in a pretty simple change to plug that up. So that's taken care of. And then Joe V worked on a bug fix for LDAP authentication failure in the global region. This one's probably been out there for a long time because it predates central admin. It actually probably existed, since we've had multiple regions and rolling up. But you have to have LDAP authentication with the MIQ LDAP library. There were just a couple places where it wasn't checking scoping queries for users in the current region, and we fixed that. It's actually a critical issue. And then an even more critical issue was the WebSocket connection leaks. So that one we've been struggling with for a long time, and thanks to the help of David Halaz, Pete Savage, and someone from Joe Orton's Apache team, they were able to narrow it down to a bug in the reuse of connections in WebSockets on Apache, and made a fix for that. So that's a pretty important one. And then a couple of fixes from our summer intern, there. So fix the appliance console crash when invalid IP address is entered in the appliance console. And also, there's an edge case where you can basically lose your V2 key altogether if you go to fetch a new one and it fails. Fix that. Next slide. Okay, and I'm going to be Alberto. I'll go through his slide. Thankfully, it's only one slide. Tim made an enhancement to return resource IDs in compressed format, which is a pretty big improvement because I believe, as it says there, it was some of the larger numbers for regions that were not 0 could cause problems for JavaScript. And then Jillian made a bunch of bug fixes as well. She plugged up returning additional virtual attributes in the result set that weren't asked for. And then also fixed accessing virtual attributes that were arrays of values, and a fix for VM retirement in the API using the correct role identifier of the product. What was it, Dave? Wow, I'm just drawing a blank. The product feature, that's what it is. Wait. Okay, I'll move on. Next slide.
Hi, for documentation in this last sprint, we had 20 PRs merged, 14 which were enhancements, and we had 6 bug fixes. Some of the highlights in there. We removed content outlining how to manually enable central administration, added more information about both tenancy quote reporting and configuring access to VNC and Splice consoles, and also added more information about SSL options for Hawkular and container providers. That's it. Next slide, please.
Right, so that brings us to the end of the Sprint 64 review. The Sprint 65 Sprint 65 review will be in 2 weeks, in July 26th. Do we have any questions? I don't see any in the chat. All right, everybody, have a great 2 weeks.